I didn't expect the attorney to read Grandpa's will with such calm authority. The man had always spoken in riddles, leaving pieces of wisdom like breadcrumbs behind him, but never revealing the full story until the time was right. That day in the oak-paneled conference room, when the air felt heavy with dust and old secrets, we were finally about to learn what he meant whenever he said, "A lifetime is measured in what you give, not what you grab." My siblings and I sat in a jagged semicircle around the long table. They were impatient, tapping their polished nails and bouncing their expensive shoes on the floor. Their confidence hung thick in the room, assured, entitled, smug. They all believed they were about to be enriched beyond their wildest fantasies. After all, Grandpa had owned vast farmland, 2 rental properties, a portfolio stacked with blue-chip stocks, and a bank account thick enough to fund 3 generations. To them, his will was merely the paperwork confirming what they thought they deserved. To me, it was something entirely different. The attorney cleared his throat. "Your grandfather left very specific instructions. His estate will be divided among you based on a percentage system. Each of you will receive the portion he believed you earned." At that word, earn, my siblings snickered. One even muttered, "Oh please, we know who the favorite was." Another elbowed her husband smugly. The tension wrapped around us like barbed wire. Then the attorney lifted the first envelope. My eldest brother leaned forward with a grin that revealed far too many teeth. But that grin evaporated the moment the attorney read aloud. "Grant receives 2%. You could have heard the dust settling. Grant sputtered, face bleaching into marble. 2%? 2? Out of everything? That can't be right." But the attorney continued unfazed. "These instructions are handwritten and notarized. They reflect your grandfather's explicit wishes." My sister Clara rocked back in her chair, laughing so sharply it echoed. "Well, if Grant only got 2, then I must be getting at least 30. Everyone knows I handled the family gatherings." She didn't laugh when her envelope revealed 5%. The room erupted, half in shock, half in outrage. The percentages were nothing like any of them imagined. They had walked into that room expecting wealth, applause, validation. What they received instead was a mirror held up to their character. And as they hurled accusations at the attorney, at each other, and eventually at me, none of them noticed that I hadn't opened my envelope yet. I sat perfectly still, hands folded, breathing quietly as chaos spun around me like a tornado. Eventually, when the shouting reached its peak, the attorney raised his hand. "We are not finished. We must read the letter your grandfather wrote specifically to accompany the division." Everyone fell silent. The envelope with my name remained sealed in front of me, but even without opening it, I felt the weight of Grandpa's intentions pressing against my chest. Because I already knew what was coming. I had known for years, and they had absolutely no idea. My name is Margaret Elise Rowan, but most people call me Maggie. I'm 67 years old, and I have lived long enough to understand that families are often defined not by blood, but by behavior. You learn who people are not in celebrations, but in the quiet, ordinary moments, the ones no one thinks matter. Grandpa saw those moments better than anyone. He raised me for a few years when life became too sharp for me to navigate alone. My marriage had collapsed, my health had wavered, and my children were grown and busy building lives far from home. So when the world felt heavy, Grandpa steadied me. I helped him in the years when his legs slowed and his breath shortened, not because I wanted anything from him, but because it felt natural, right, to return the care he once gave me. But my siblings? They orbited Grandpa only when they sensed opportunity. When they wanted money. When they needed a last-minute babysitter. When they wanted to take pictures for social media to make themselves appear devoted. They never saw Grandpa as a person with a story still unfolding. They saw him as a vault. I suppose that's why I felt strangely calm as I sat in the attorney's office. Not proud, not expectant, just peaceful. Whatever Grandpa left me, whether large or small, I already felt like I'd received more from him in life than any inheritance could provide. But peace has a complicated way of unsettling those who demand control. My siblings always resented how close Grandpa and I were, even though I had never claimed the title of favorite. They assigned it to me so they'd have someone to blame for their own distance. I leaned back in the leather chair, the kind that creaked with age, and watched their panic unfolding. In a different world, in a different family, I might have tried to soothe them. But years of subtle cruelty had taught me silence was safer. The attorney adjusted his glasses. "Your grandfather wrote that he based the percentages on emotional contribution, time invested, and demonstrated integrity." The words landed like stones. Grant snapped, Integrity? Are we being judged now? Yes, the attorney replied. By the man who built the estate you're inheriting. My envelope sat untouched. I ran my thumb along the flap, feeling the raised edge of the paper. I didn't need confirmation, but I also knew the moment I opened it, everything would change, for them and for me. For now, I waited. Grandpa always said, timing is part of wisdom. And I had learned to respect timing. My family has always been a puzzle with pieces that never quite fit. We grew up under the same roof, ate at the same table, and shared the same last name. Yet somehow we became for entirely different shapes carved by for entirely different storms. Grant, the eldest, grew up convinced leadership meant barking orders at anyone within earshot. He wore responsibility like armor, but only when someone was watching. Behind closed doors, he avoided hard work with a skill that could almost be admired for its consistency. His relationship with Grandpa was polite but shallow, a handshake instead of a heart connection. Clara had charm. That was her weapon of choice. She could orchestrate a dinner party worthy of a magazine spread, but she rarely stayed behind to help with dishes or cleanup. Her care for Grandpa was measured by convenience. If she had a spare afternoon or a fresh manicure she was proud to show off, she'd stop by for a brief, glittering visit. She always greeted him with warmth, but warmth isn't the same as presence. Then there was our youngest brother, Evan. Sweet at heart, but seduced early by get-rich-quick schemes. He showed up for Grandpa when he needed advice or cash, but rarely to give anything in return. Grandpa didn't judge him harshly. He simply saw him clearly. And then there was me. I didn't try to be different. I wasn't competing for the best grandchild badge. Life humbled me early, and humility has a way of teaching you to listen. I visited Grandpa because I loved him, not because I expected something in return. I cooked for him, drove him to doctor appointments, helped organize his finances when his eyesight weakened. He never asked. I simply noticed and acted. But my siblings noticed too, though not in the way I'd hoped. Over time, subtle irritation crept into their voices. They rolled their eyes when Grandpa praised my cooking. They sighed dramatically when he said things like, "Maggie understands me." They accused me, half jokingly, half seriously, of angling for a bigger slice of the pie. The truth was simpler. I didn't want a pie. I wanted him. One winter evening, just a year before he passed, Grandpa and I sat on his porch wrapped in blankets. He gazed at the frost crawling across the window and said, "You know, Maggie, people show who they are when they think no one's keeping score." I didn't know then that he was already designing the ledger that would later ignite the chaos in that attorney's office. But looking back, the pieces fall into place. My siblings weren't bad people, just busy ones, distracted ones who treated family responsibility like an intermittent chore. And maybe I resented them more than I cared to admit. Not for the absence itself, but for their refusal to acknowledge it. Because absence has weight. It tallies up over time. And Grandpa had been tallying. The first crack in the family veneer surfaced long before Grandpa passed, though none of us recognized it immediately. It began with a missing check. One small slip of paper that should have gone from Grandpa's pocket to a maintenance contractor polishing the barn floors on his farmland. The contractor called Grandpa one morning, confused and apologetic. "Sir, I wouldn't bother you," but the check bounced. I remember Grandpa's face that day. His confusion was sharp, jagged, like he'd been startled by his own handwriting. He sat at the kitchen table with the checkbook open, the ledger neat and precise, as always, but missing one entry from earlier that month. A withdrawal of $12,000. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Evan's. He had a habit of dramatically looping the ends of his numbers, a flourish he'd never broken even in adulthood. Grandpa stared at the page in silence. Not anger, hurt. That quiet, complicated hurt that sits in the lungs like too little air. He didn't confront Evan immediately. He waited. He hoped, naively, lovingly, that his grandson would come forward on his own. He never did. Instead, Evan returned the following week with stories of a temporary setback, a promising deal, and just needing a little bridge money. He didn't know Grandpa already had the evidence in his ledger. But Grandpa didn't tell him. He didn't want shame to be the way the lesson landed. He wanted honesty. But honesty never came. Then came Clara's betrayal. Not as dramatic, but just as painful. Grandpa discovered that she'd quietly listed one of his rental homes as her investment partner property on a loan application, claiming entitlement to future earnings. When confronted, she brushed it off as just paperwork. not understanding why Grandpa looked at her like she'd spoken in a foreign tongue. And Grant, his betrayal was quieter but sharper. He had been designated executor years prior, a role requiring trust. Yet Grandpa discovered that he'd been inflating expenses for property repairs and pocketing the difference. Small amounts at a time, barely detectable, but the pattern was unmistakable. Each betrayal was a thread pulled from the fabric of trust. And I became the witness, the silent observer, the one who stayed late after each incident, making tea for Grandpa while he wrestled with disappointment. He never ranted. He never sought revenge. Instead, he wrote notes, records, dates, percentages, all of it tucked inside a small wooden box I assumed held old photographs. I didn't know it contained the blueprint for everything that would unfold in that attorney's office. The wooden box lived on the top shelf of Grandpa's study. I'd dust it occasionally but never opened it. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed without invitation. But a month before he died, Grandpa asked me to bring it to him. He sat in his armchair, thinner than he used to be, yet his eyes were brighter than ever. "Maggie," he said softly, "it's time you understood the whole story." The box creaked open like something sacred. Inside were 3 stacks of documents bound with twine, each labeled with a name, Grant, Clara, Evan, and a 4th, smaller bundle marked with just one word, Maggie. He handed me the smallest one first. Inside were copies of birthday cards I wrote him when I was in my 30s. Grocery receipts from times I insisted on paying. Notes from doctor visits I'd accompanied him to. It was a record not of transactions, but of presence. Tears rose before I could stop them. Then he handed me the other stacks. Each was meticulously compiled. Photographs of checks. Screenshots of bank statements. Loan documents Clara had submitted. Expense invoices Grant corrected. Copies of text messages from Evan asking for money for emergencies that coincided with casino withdrawals. Everything was documented, time-stamped, verified. "Why keep all this?" I whispered, overwhelmed by the weight of it. "Because truth needs witnesses," he said. "And because someday they'll pretend none of it happened." That simple sentence cut deeper than any betrayal. For weeks after that, at his request, I helped him organize the evidence chronologically. We consulted a lawyer who specialized in estate planning. We drafted letters. We arranged the will in a way that was not vindictive but honest. Grandfather insisted the percentages reflect the ratio of presence to absence, the ratio of integrity to opportunity. He wasn't punishing them. He was measuring them. And in the process, I learned something important. Revenge isn't loud. It isn't fire or fury. True justice is quiet, methodical, and devastatingly clear. The most surprising part? Grandpa never removed them from the will entirely. He believed in responsibility. He believed inheritance wasn't a reward. It was a reflection. When we completed the documentation, Grandpa smiled with a softness I hadn't seen in years. "Now," he said, "everything is in place. And when the time comes, Maggie, don't shield them from the truth. They earned their part in this story." I promised him I would honor his wishes. But I didn't realize how volatile the aftermath would be, or how fiercely they would turn on me when the truth surfaced. The attorney lifted the final envelope, mine, without ceremony. My siblings stared at it as though it were radioactive. Their earlier smugness had evaporated, replaced by suspicion, bitterness, and fear. I opened it with steady hands. Inside was a single sheet. Margaret Rowan receives 83% of the estate. The number rang through the room like a bell struck by lightning. Clara shot to her feet. 83? That's absurd. That's manipulation. Maggie must have influenced him. Grant pointed at me as if he'd discovered the villain in a murder mystery. "This is elder abuse. I'm calling the court. I'm calling the police. This is fraud." Evan, for once, said nothing. His face collapsed inward, pale and stricken, as though he remembered every check, every lie, every missed opportunity. The attorney held up his hand. "Your grandfather anticipated your reactions. He left a letter for all of you." He unfolded the pages and began reading. "Children, what you received today reflects not my love, but my observation. Love is equal, effort is not. Some of you visited when convenient. Some of you withdrew more than you gave. Some, one, showed up in ways that have no price." The room tightened. Clara muttered, "This is ridiculous. You can't quantify love." "It isn't quantifying love," the attorney clarified. "It's quantifying behavior." Then he read the percentages aloud again, accompanied by the reasoning Grandpa had documented. Thoroughly, painfully, unavoidably. The financial betrayals, the absences, the excuses. The evidence stack was placed on the table like a final verdict. Grant's voice trembled with rage. Maggie planned this. She set us up. But the attorney contradicted him immediately. Your sister never asked for more. In fact, she asked whether she should even be included. I froze. I didn't know Grandpa had shared that. Their accusations lost steam. Their anger turned inward, ricocheting off the truth they had spent years avoiding. For the first time, I felt the atmosphere shift, not in my favor, but toward clarity. This was the turning point. Once their denial cracked, it made room for something else: consequences. They realized they couldn't challenge the will. It was too detailed, too well-prepared, too airtight. The same meticulousness they used to mock Grandpa for had become the fortress protecting his final decision. I inhaled slowly, knowing this was only the beginning. Justice, ethical, measured justice, doesn't land all at once. It lands in echoes. And the first echo had just struck. Consequences rarely arrive like storms. They don't roar. They seep. They settle. They reshape landscapes quietly, permanently. For my siblings, the downfall began in subtle, painful increments. Grant's undoing came first. As executor, he had long enjoyed small advantages: overseeing property repairs, controlling contractor payments, authorizing maintenance expenses. After Grandpa's documents were reviewed, the attorney found discrepancies. Significant ones. Patterns that suggested intentional inflation. He wasn't prosecuted. Grandpa had asked that we refrain from legal harm. But he was removed as executor, publicly and formally. Word traveled. Overnight, the man who'd built his identity on authority found himself without credibility. His business partners hesitated. His reputation fractured. Grant withdrew from the family entirely, not out of shame, but out of wounded pride. Clara's reckoning was quieter. Her loan application, which falsely listed ownership in Grandpa's rental property, flagged complications after his death. Lenders don't appreciate creative interpretations. They reevaluated her financial standing, leading to a cascade of complications in her already fragile boutique business. She blamed me, of course, called me cold, dramatic, ungrateful. But beneath her fury was something I'd never seen before: fear. The fear that charm could no longer override accountability. Evan's consequence was the most heartbreaking. He wasn't angry, he was defeated. When he learned Grandpa had documented the withdrawn checks and casino transactions, something inside him broke. Not out of guilt, but because he realized Grandpa saw through him all along. He confessed to me one night, voice cracking. I stole from the one person who never turned his back on me. And he still left me something. Grandpa had given him 10%, a number that wasn't punitive but symbolic. Enough to show love. Small enough to reflect truth. Each sibling spiraled in their own way. But none of them spiraled publicly. There were no dramatic confrontations, no lawsuits, no violent outbursts. Just silence. A silence that expanded each day, pressing into their lives like a dense fog. They avoided each other. They avoided me. They avoided any reminder of the man who had measured them with heartbreaking accuracy. And while their worlds constricted, mine expanded. Not because of the inheritance, though it was substantial, but because clarity is a kind of freedom. For the first time in decades, I understood that the weight I had carried wasn't responsibility, but imbalance. And now the scales were level. In the weeks after the will reading, the air in my home felt strangely lighter. Not because of money, though the sudden shift in financial security was undeniably profound, but because I finally understood the shape of my family without illusions. For years, I'd tried to hold us together, believing unity was something that could be willed into existence. But unity built on denial is like wallpaper over cracked plaster. Pretty at first, but temporary. I spent quiet afternoons sorting through Grandpa's belongings. Old tools. Faded letters. Photographs of him as a young man, smiling beside a tractor that looked older than I was. He'd lived through decades where survival required grit, where character mattered more than convenience. I found peace in the ritual of cleaning, organizing, remembering. And in those moments, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt something gentler. Completion. Not with revenge in my heart, but with clarity. The next morning I met with Leah in her office. She had already drafted a notice for the estate attorney requesting a formal review of all property documents, including supplemental deeds. She handed me the letter to sign. Once this is submitted, she said, They cannot distribute or remove any part of the property until the legal discrepancy is settled. Will they know I initiated it? They will, she said gently. And they may not react well. I signed anyway. Later that afternoon, I returned to Grandma's house. The air was thick with tension. Boxes stacked halfway to the ceiling. Relatives moving with irritated energy. Daniel stood in the living room with a clipboard, as if he were the executor himself. When he saw me, he forced a smile. We were just sorting furniture, he said. If you want anything, let me know. He emphasized the word want carefully, as if I didn't already own more than he realized. I nodded politely. Thank you. But for now, I'm just here to observe. His eyes narrowed slightly. He sensed a shift, but he didn't know its origin yet. And that was exactly how it needed to be. At sunset, as I prepared to leave, I walked through the orchard behind the house. The blooming branches brushed my sleeves like soft reminders of every summer I'd spent here. And for the first time since Grandma passed, I didn't feel hollow. I felt anchored, grounded, ready. The turning point had arrived quietly, not with anger, but with choice. I was no longer reacting. I was acting. The next steps would be deliberate, documented, and entirely unstoppable. And soon, very soon, those who had whispered in the shadows would have to answer to the truth spoken aloud. The estate review meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning. Neutral location. Long conference table polished to a shine. A pitcher of water untouched. Files neatly stacked at each seat. Daniel walked in first, followed by Haley. Both looked confident, too confident. They smiled at the attorney as if greeting an ally. They did not smile at me. When Leah entered, carrying the sealed evidence envelope, their faces tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. The estate attorney, a meticulous man named Sharp, began the session with procedural formalities, then opened the floor to supplemental documentation relevant to the property. Leah slid the envelope forward. This is a deed, she said calmly, executed by the late Margaret Connolly, transferring ownership of the primary property to her daughter and granddaughter before her death. Daniel straightened. That can't be right. There is no such deed. Attorney Sharp raised an eyebrow. We will determine that shortly. Leah opened the envelope and laid out the reconstructed notarization page, the signatures, the dates, the clean scans. Haley's breath caught audibly. Daniel leaned forward, jaw tightening. Where did you get that? Leah didn't look at him. The question is not where. The question is why it was removed. Attorney Sharp examined every sheet slowly, methodically. His silence carried weight. When he finished, he folded his hands and looked directly at Daniel. This appears valid. Legally executed. Binding. Haley shook her head. It must be old. Outdated. Sharp adjusted his glasses. It is newer than the will, which means it supersedes it. A small sound escaped Daniel. Shock, frustration, maybe both. Leah added, we also have photographic evidence that the document was recently taken from its original location and hidden. And that part of it was intentionally destroyed. Both their faces drained of color. Sharp exhaled sharply. I will need to initiate an investigation into tampering with estate property. In the meantime, all distribution activities are frozen. No one is to remove anything further from the house. Daniel swallowed hard. You can't assume we did anything. We do not assume, Sharp said. We follow evidence. The silence that followed was devastating. Not to me, but to them. In that silence lived their downfall. Quiet. Inevitable. Self-inflicted. The review ended with formal documentation and written acknowledgement from all parties. Daniel signed with shaking hands. Haley couldn't meet my eyes. As we exited the building, Daniel finally spoke. You blindsided us. His voice was controlled, but the tremor beneath each word betrayed him. No, I said softly. You blindsided yourselves when you tried to erase her wishes. He looked away. Haley muttered. We just wanted what was fair. Fairness, I replied, is not achieved by theft. They had no response. Their downfall wasn't dramatic. No arrest. No shouting match in the parking lot. Just exposure. Truth laid bare under legal scrutiny. And sometimes that is the most profound justice of all. The weeks that followed were quiet. The estate attorney completed his investigation swiftly. The evidence of tampering was undeniable, but Grandma's firm execution of the deed was even more undeniable. The property transferred to my mother and me automatically. My mother, who now lived in assisted care, signed her portion over to me with a tired but relieved smile. I'm glad she trusted you, she said. You were always the steady one. Steady. That word carried new meaning now. Daniel kept his distance. He attended the formal estate closing but spoke little. Haley avoided me entirely. The cousins retreated into polite, hesitant conversations, uncertain whether I saw them as allies or accomplices. But they weren't part of the deception, and I treated them as such. I rebuilt my relationship with the house slowly, intentionally. I cleared out the rooms not with resentment, but with reverence. I kept the quilt I had wanted, the rosary, the cooking notes. I restored the orchard one tree at a time. The land began to feel familiar again, not as relics of the past, but as something living, breathing. Something I was meant to steward. One late afternoon, Helen returned. She walked the property with me, her cane tapping softly against the stones. When we reached the old barn, she rested her hand on my arm. She was proud of you, she said. Even before all this. She knew you wouldn't be intimidated by noise masquerading as authority. I laughed softly. I didn't feel brave. Bravery rarely feels like bravery while we're doing it. We watched the sun dip low behind the trees, warm light scattering across the fields. For the first time since Grandma's passing, the grief didn't hurt. It simply lived inside me, softer now, like a resting bird. In the evenings, I settled into routines again, tea, reading, tending to the land. Some nights I heard echoes of the past. Laughter from summer gatherings, Grandma humming while hanging laundry, children chasing one another through the orchard. The anger had faded. The hurt had too. What remained was clarity.